Hello and welcome to the Apologetics 315 podcast with your hosts Brian Auten and Chad Gross. Join us for conversations and interviews on the topics of apologetics, evangelism, and the Christian worldview.
Everybody online, looking good.
Hello and welcome to the podcast. This is Brian Auten, and I'm recording as always from the Shire of Northern Ireland, and I'm joined by Chad Gross, who's thick in the frozen tundra of Lake Geneva, Wisconsin, at the annual Defenders Conference. Chad, can you hear me?
No, I can hear you. I woke up this morning. It was 13 degrees, and the real feel was -4. So it is definitely cold here at the hell of a conference, which is what it's called. I'm not swearing, because the topic of the conference is what is hell, the nature of hell, the duration of hell. And so it's been a very great opportunity to learn more.
So they've been talking about 4 different perspectives on the doctrine of hell. For those who might not be familiar with various perspectives, can you kind of lay them out, what they're talking about?
Yeah, so Chris Date is here, and I would be surprised if listeners weren't somewhat aware of Chris Date. He runs the Rethinking Hell ministry and is a proponent of conditional immortality, which is that immortality is only given to the saved, and the unsaved are annihilated. In other words, they cease to exist. Eric Rattan is here. And he is actually defending universalism, the view that ultimately all are saved. Sean Balinsky defended eternal conscious torment, that the duration of hell is eternal, and as is the punishment. And then James Bilby gave a very, very interesting talk about a post-mortem opportunity. Now, that one for me was probably, I've listened to Chris so much, and Chris was just so sharp and so well put together, just exactly what I expected from Chris. I had not heard Dr. Bilby speak on this, and so that one for me was the most interesting and gave me the most to think about. And of course, I can unpack his argument a bit more if you want, but I just will say that for listeners, when they hear post-mortem opportunity, they might think what I thought it was going to be, which means everybody has a second chance after they die to accept Christ. That is actually not what Dr. Bilby is a proponent of. And it was much more nuanced than that. And so those are the main speakers. And then there were some breakout sessions. They were very interesting. Last night, Kurt Jaros, who is hosting the event through Veracity Hill, and he spoke on the historic St. Patrick, which of course was appropriate considering it was St. Patrick's Day. And that's always, since I attended an Anglican church a few years back, that's always been an interesting topic for me. I presented on Jesus as a master thinker today, arguing that Jesus was very well versed in reason and logic and had a very high view of argumentation. And then we heard another talk today on the cults and the afterlife. And we heard about how the Mormons, the Jehovah's Witnesses, and Scientologists view the afterlife. And so that's what we've been doing. And this evening, the main plenary speakers, who the 4 I mentioned prior, they're going to do a responses to one another. And then tomorrow there's kind of an open Q&A with all 4 of them. So that should be a lot of fun.
I wonder, of the different speakers, for instance, Chris Date representing conditional immortality, I can imagine if there was just a couple of views represented, the traditional view and the annihilationist view or conditional immortality view, that would be maybe the one that people were not familiar with, and there would be quite a bit of maybe pushback or a lot of questions regarding that. But in this case, you're mentioning Eric Rattan talking about universalism. I would think there would be quite a bit of pushback on that. I wonder how that came across.
Yeah, that's a great question. He probably did have the most people line up, but Chris also had quite a bit. And there were a number of people who had not heard that perspective. I think, to be fair to them, I understood why they had so many questions, because I think Dr. Rattan did successfully demonstrate that universalism is possible. I don't think in any way that he was able to, in the 50 minutes he was allotted, which I'm sympathetic to that, demonstrate that it was probable. There were a lot of things left unsaid that left a lot of people wondering. And that's just kind of the nature of it, especially when you're hearing a case for the first time. But yeah, certainly a lot of people had some questions about universalism for sure.
So tonight they're going to be interacting with one another and questioning each other?
Tonight, each one of them has 30 minutes to respond to the other three. And so, for example, Chris Date will have a chance to respond to Dr. Rutan and Dr. Balinsky and Dr. Bilby, and then the other three will have an opportunity to respond as well, which I do have to tell you something that really funny that happened. Chris, first of all, I had to follow Chris Date. I had to follow Chris Date on my talk. And that just seemed unfair, like straight out of the gate. But what was really funny is that in the program, Chris is on top because they have the profile pictures of the speakers, right? And Chris is on top. So it says Mr. Chris Date. Then it says Dr. Eric Rutan, Dr. Sean, Dr. James. Okay, so Chris gets up there and says, I have to confess that I feel somewhat like an imposter when I'm at a conference like this. And to make it worse, Kurt had to put me on the top with Mr. in the program. So, of course, everybody got a laugh. So when I got up, Chris was in the audience, which that wasn't intimidating at all. But Chris was in the audience and I said, hey, Chris, I can sympathize with your Mr. Chris Date, but I'm an elementary school teacher here. So nobody's lower on the rung than I am, man. So that was kind of funny. But yeah, so they're going to respond to one another this evening.
That's going to be cool. So James Bealby, you mentioned, he's got a great book that has a lot of praise, and that's called Thinking About Christian Apologetics, What It Is and Why We Do It. So there's a book to recommend. Well, tell me a little bit more about his view, if you have a few moments just to unpack that and what you took away from that.
Yeah. So when I first heard post-mortem opportunity, and I told Dr. Bilby this today, actually, I talked to him a bit. I assumed that what that meant is everybody had the opportunity to accept Christ after they died, if they hadn't in life. That's what I assumed. That is not what Dr. Bilby was arguing for. What Dr. Bilby is actually arguing for is a post-mortem opportunity for those who never had a chance to receive the gospel. And so that, to me, so in other words, this is a way to try to solve that problem, that classic problem of the unevangelized. So it got me thinking. He laid out some options of how Christians have classically tried to deal with this problem. One way is kind of the Calvinist way, which he calls restrictivism, which just means, salvation's only for the elect. Another way he laid it out is a universal opportunity, which it's kind of the Romans 1 idea. If somebody responds to general revelation, they're longing for God, they're reaching for God, then God will get the message to them somehow. And then he has inclusivism, which I think this is a view that I've heard like Dr. Craig articulate, where somebody might not necessarily have accepted the gospel, but based upon the light that they had at the time, and their location and both geographically and historically, they can be saved still through Christ's atonement, but in that way. Well, he didn't find any of those satisfactory. He brought up problems such as, what about like the pseudo-evangelized? So in other words, somebody hears the gospel, but it's actually not the gospel. It's a fake gospel. They think they've accepted it. They think they're okay, but then of course they haven't. The biggest problem he brought up again were those who just never heard. And so his argument goes like this. It's two premises and a conclusion. And again, this is the theological argument for postmortem opportunity. It says, God desires that all people be saved. And by the way, just for clarification, Dr. Bilby is an Arminian. And so he does say that this view does make sense on Arminianism. It is out of his Arminianism that it's birthed, if you will. So premise 1, God desires that all people be saved. Premise 2, there are some who do not receive an opportunity to be saved in this life. Conclusion, therefore, God will provide a postmortem opportunity to those who do not receive a pre-death opportunity or a pre-mortem opportunity. And so I thought this gave me a lot to think about. I thought it was a unique way to solve the problem of the unevangelized. It's definitely a different way than I have tried to address the problem. And in the past, I've addressed it before in a apologetics message that I did at a church. And so I told him after his talk that it wasn't what I thought it was going to be, and that he gave me a lot to think about. And so that was probably the one for me that I took away with the most kind of ahas and challenges.
Yeah, I'd like to hear that because that's really interesting.
Like I said, it's a lot more nuanced than I thought it was going to be, and I found it very engaging, very thoughtful. And I'm not on board. I'm not, woohoo, that's my view. That's not where I'm at. But it was, it definitely gave me a lot to think about, like I said.
So does Bealby's view, would he apply that to the traditional view of hell, or does that sort of apply whatever way you see the nature of the final judgment?
Yeah, the way that I understood it is first of all, he didn't take a position. So he didn't take a conditional immortality position. He didn't take an eternal conscious torment position. But the way that I understand it is this view would be compatible with either.
All right. Let's hear a little bit about your breakout session there called Jesus as the Master Thinker. Do you want to give us some tasty tidbits or anything like that?
Yeah, sure. I'd love to. So I don't know, about a year, maybe two ago, I was scrolling through Facebook and I saw Ben Watkins of Real Atheology quote Bertrand Russell on the Gospels. And he said this, he said, "So far as I can remember, there is not one word in the Gospels in praise of intelligence." And so that really, having studied the Gospels and especially how Jesus uses reason and logic in his interactions with the Pharisees and the Sadducees, and even encouraging critical thinking among the disciples, it kind of bothered me. He hashtagged it "Make Facts Matter" again. And so that stuck with me. So throughout my research, I also stumbled across a quote from the late atheist Michael Martin. And Michael Martin says on Jesus in the Gospels, "The Jesus of the Gospels does not exemplify important, intelligent, intellectual virtues. Both his words and his actions seem to indicate that he does not value reason and logic." When Kurt Jaros asked me to come and speak, I thought it was a good opportunity to take some passages from the Gospels and demonstrate how Jesus does indeed value reason and learning, and also how the New Testament actually elevates intelligence and sound thinking as a type of worship. And so that's how I argued. I basically defended two major contentions in my opening speech. So
yeah, thanks.
Contention one was the Gospels do praise intelligence and even elevate it as a type of worship. And premise two was that Jesus's words and actions clearly demonstrate that he does value reason and learning. Now, obviously, I'm not going to go through the whole talk here because it was 45 minutes long. And so we're not going to take the time to do that. But basically, what I did is I took Matthew 22:37, when Jesus says, "Love the Lord God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind." And I argued that Jesus purposely changes. He takes the verse from Deuteronomy 6:5, "Love the Lord God with all your heart, soul, and might," and he changes it to mind. Now, what's interesting there is that word there in the Greek, mind, describes the place where thinking occurs. So we see here that Jesus's intentional word exchange raises the bar for Christians. J. Warner Wallace puts it like this. He says, "We are not only to love God with all of our heart, soul, and might, but we are all commanded to love God with our mind, our intelligence, to understand the truth of Christianity. This effort is an act of worship." And so then what I did is I took passages from the Gospels, most notably Matthew 22, and I showed how things like Jesus escaping the horns of a dilemma. I showed that Jesus used reductio ad absurdum arguments. I argued that Jesus valued using evidence. You'll recall when John the Baptist send someone to Jesus to say, basically, John wants to know if you're the one that we're waiting on, or should we expect somebody else? And Jesus says, well, look at the things I'm doing. And he points to his works, what he's done, the blind see, the lame walk, et cetera, and he appeals to the evidence to demonstrate the truth of what he's saying. And so then finally, kind of to land the plane, I did deal with some alleged anti-intellectual passages associated with Jesus, Doubting Thomas passage, of course, and when the Pharisees and the Sadducees come to Jesus in Matthew, and they demand a sign in Matthew 12, and Jesus calls them a wicked and adulterous generation. And I showed how it wasn't that they wanted evidence that Jesus was rebuking. It was actually the fact that the intent of their heart that he was rebuking. And then finally, I did look at Hebrews 11:1, because even though that's not in the Gospels, how can you not deal with Hebrews 11:1 when you're talking about anti-intellectualism and blind faith and whatnot? And and then I ended just by arguing that not only is this important to our discipleship, because if Jesus valued reason and logic, then we should as well, but it's also important for unbelievers because it's attractive to unbelievers to see Jesus as someone who was intelligent.
Good stuff. Any good questions at the conclusion of your talk?
Yeah, there were. There was one gentleman who brought up the fact that we don't want to overemphasize Jesus's reason and use of reason and logic and argumentation, and de-emphasize his moral character and things like that. And I had actually said in my talk that the reason that I was focusing on Jesus's use of reason and logic was because I was challenging the assertions made by Bertrand Russell and Michael Martin. And I agreed with him that we certainly want to preach and share a fully orbed view of Jesus.
Of course, yes.
Right. But that for this specific talk, that wasn't my purpose. And also, I'm not sure how one would be able to fully capture Jesus in a 45-minute talk. So that was interesting. Chris Date asked me, which I thought was a great question. He agreed with the arguments in my talk and said some nice things. But then he said, what about the people who they don't really have the capacity to master these things, that loving God with their mind in this way is difficult? I thought that was a great question. And so I shared with him that a couple of things that came to mind was that, number one, we need to think about the fact that we're all not required to be say, Chris Date or James Bilby or William Lane Craig or whoever you want to name. We're all just required to love God with all our mind. That's going to look different for each person. Everybody's not going to progress as far down that road as others. And so we are just required to do what we can with what we have where we're at. And then the other thing I said and this is something I try to point out to people, is that it's very likely that when you're in a conversation with someone, they're going to ask a question you don't know the answer to. It's just very likely. There's so many questions and so many different ways to formulate them. But you necessarily don't have to always have the answer. But what you do want to do is you want to follow up and get the answer for them, or direct them to somebody who does have the answer. So in other words, you want to make sure that you're thinking about, hey, there's this Brian Auten and he's in my church and I know he enjoys studying this stuff. So I'm going to go talk to him and maybe get an answer to my friend, or maybe I can have coffee with Brian and my friend.
Yeah, that's good stuff. Everybody doesn't have the same capacity as, the next person.
Yeah, I thought that was a really good point. And then lastly, there was actually an atheist at the conference, and he got up and he said that he actually didn't disagree with anything I said in my talk. He thought it was presented well. He said that he just had an issue with, he brought up Jesus being in the tomb for 3 days and 3 nights, but it actually wasn't 3 days and 3 nights. And of course, I tried to explain to him that by Jewish reckoning, it would have been. And he said that was not satisfactory to him. And I politely said, well, I said, that's what theologians do, right? They discuss these topics, and different theologians have different ways of explaining that. And there are various views. But at the end of the day, that really doesn't affect the case that I've made here today. And so he seemed okay with that. And so, it was really fun. But again, very, very intimidating to look out into an audience and see Eric Rattan and Chris Date sitting there. And you're wondering, man, I hope I don't sound like an idiot, you know?
Were you able to work in any sort of Ghostbusters quotes, into the talk?
I absolutely worked in a Ghostbusters quote. And I actually said in the talk that for those of you that listen to the Apologetics 315 podcast, you know that Brian and I will quote some Ghostbusters. When I read the quote from Bertrand Russell and Michael Martin, I couldn't help thinking, what would Ray Stantz, the heart and soul of the Ghostbusters, say to Russell and Martin? And I think, Brian, he would simply look at him and say,
You never studied.
Yes, indeed. Right. Well, that about wraps it up for our report from the frozen tundra of Lake Geneva, Wisconsin at the annual Defenders Conference. I think if you want to find out more about that, you can go to thedefendersconference.com, just in case they're going to be posting any sort of audio or anything or video from those. I'm not sure if that's going to happen, but you can bookmark it for the future for next year. Going to transition now over to Jacob from SAFT Apologetics, and he's going to give us a report from what's going on with SAFT Apologetics. All right, I'm with Jacob Varghese from SAFT Apologetics. Jacob, it's been since episode 17, and this is, episode in the hundreds now. So what has been going on since our last chat?
Oh yeah, a lot has transpired since our last chat, and it's so good to be back on the podcast, Brian. Thank you for having me here with you to discuss about what has happened at SAFT. We're very appreciative of the way you support and you stand with us. It's a great encouragement for us. So I think the last time we came together, it was in December of 2021, if I recall right. Mm-hmm. And I was at a completely different apartment when we were doing the recording at night. So from after that, in April of 2022, we had our Areopagus conference, and that was our second time we did the conference. And by God's grace, we were able to do it at a much larger, a much more higher quality level, the conference. So we were able to partner with Women in Apologetics and do the conference in tandem with them. We had 9 speakers across 3 days, and we also had renowned Christian musicians from India who were leading worship on each day. And it was such a stellar experience for us to put together and to be a part of. The engagement from the audience was top class, and also we were able to get access to a supreme conferencing platform that one of our friends at Reasonable Faith extended us to use for the conference, and it took the conference experience to a next level. It was not a Zoom webinar level conference where the audiences came in and sat and they just listened through, but we had tables for people to come together and connect with different audience members, get to know them, discuss. We had booths where we put up the booths for free for all of our ministry partners in India, where they put up their booth details, their ministry details, and people were able to come there, get details, be introduced to ministries. And I even got to know that a couple of ministries from some of our friends here in India were connected with another ministry in the US. So ministry partnerships were budding at the conference. And speakers, specifically Lydia McGrew and some of the other speakers, they stayed back after the sessions, went to the tables with the audience, and took some time to chat and interact and field some more extra questions after the Q&A. And so it was just an amazing experience to put together that conference. And we realized that we were able to deliver, by God's grace, a conference that is of a great standard. And so we realized that, we don't want to do the conference every year as some sort of a routine, because we did it the last 2 years. We realized the next time we do the conference, we want to do it really well, very specific. And so we have just put on hold the conference plans for the moment as we plan together to do the next one really, really well. So that was the main thing that happened. Then the new addition to the ministry was our blog, SAFT blog, which you can find at blog.saftapologetics.com. And it has taken off really well. We have started receiving guest articles and guest partnerships with people across the globe. And we are putting together a wide variety of content on there. We are focusing on 4 domains. We're looking at apologetics, theology, philosophy, and Christian living. And so the first 3, yes, that's what people would expect from an apologetics blog site. The last one, Christian living, is focusing on real life practical ways of walking the Christian walk. And we believe that that is also quite necessary in this domain, as our goal is to equip the believer defend their faith anytime, anywhere. We believe that having an active, practicing faith that is living, that is walking the talk, is quite important. And so we're bringing in devotional level content from our friends who are supportive of the ministry and who are able to contribute in that very specific capacity to encourage the reader and to edify and nourish their hearts. So those two were some of the biggest updates that happened. Then we kept pushing with our podcast. We covered a total of 77 episodes so far in across 4 seasons, and we have peaked over 4.5k downloads, 4,500 downloads, and the presence of the podcast is felt across 70 countries. And as the podcast continued to reach, we were able to reach out to and respond to different speaking invitation opportunities. And for that regard, we expand our team to include 2 adjunct speakers, Alan and Nitish, and all of the speakers are part of the Reasonable Faith team as well as chapter directors. So myself, Alan, Nitish, we are all chapter directors with Reasonable Faith. And in regards to that, we were able to have an understanding with the Reasonable Faith team, the ministry itself, to consider every new Reasonable Faith Indian chapter director to be suggested to SAFT, so that we can consider them to be part of the SAFT team, so that this partnership from SAFT and Reasonable Faith chapters would continue to grow, and that we would be able to cater to the Indian audience much more effectively with hand in hand. And in that regards, our speaker Nitish, he spoke at a Hindi speaking setting in Jaipur, in the state of Rajasthan in North India, and he took a Hindi apologetics session, and it was a great response. Hindi speaking audience members came up to him and they were encouraged by what he spoke. And also the speaking team is quite diverse in the fact that we're all very young. I am coming from an economics background. Alan is coming from a medicine doctor's background. Nitish is a practicing lawyer. And so we have this diverse crowd of speakers who are coming together, young at heart, passionate to win India for Christ. And with that regard, the speaking team came together, and Brian, you yourself and our friend Lydia, we've come together to work on an ebook that is aimed at introducing the Indian audience to an introductory level introduction to apologetics. And that has been in the works, and we're very much looking forward to releasing that at the earliest as a good resource for people to get accustomed with. And so we all learned on our own. We're all continuously learning. And so the objective was to put together an ebook that is easy to consume, but also not something that is diluting of the rigorous content that Christian apologetics has been developed over the centuries. And as the ministry continued to grow, we expanded the team. We have expanded our technical team to be able to deliver videos and contents with high standard and high quality. And the ministry partnerships continue to grow, specifically with our friends at Elohim Gospel Ministries, their EGM Times magazine. We have a 1-year partnership with them to contribute to a column called Confident Answers, where I'm answering audience question, the reader's question that comes in on questions on apologetics, questions that challenge the faith. In every edition that happens for 1 year, I would be contributing and responding to audience question that comes in, and that has been a very fruitful ministry partnership with them. And we believe that we will be able to minister to them in the best God-honoring way possible, so that we can take that partnership forward. And ministry network in India continues to grow. Especially most recently, I finished 7-hour training programs for a group of teachers who are part of a kids ministry. And the team reached out to me and they said, we just want to start off something and try and train our teachers, give them some exposure to what is happening in the field of apologetics, so that they know what can be delivered. And I did a 7-hour series with this teachers team, getting them exposed to what kids are getting exposed to, how to walk them through what are the things to be aware of, and to be aware of this changing culture that is permeating even the Indian cultural fabric. And most recently, I think for the 3rd or 4th time, I came on an Indian television, a Christian Indian television, and was speaking most recently on the pro-life case. And the previous editions spoke on arguments for God, the moral argument, and so on and so forth. And that has been a great way for us to have more exposure and put ourselves out there, available in whatever form possible to the Indian audience. And our ministry work has been progressing on all fronts. And it was a heartwarming moment for us to know when I was corresponding with Vince Vitale. He shared a word of encouragement to us, encouraging the work that we were doing. And it's always encouraging for us when people we look up to, people who have contributed to the field quite well, congratulate the work that we do. And so these are small encouraging words, positives that help us to keep moving forward, along with the grace of the Holy Spirit who keeps pushing us forward. And then very exciting thing that's happening is we are looking to work out some apologetics merch for India. And we are partnering with our friends here in India. And we just started working on what we can do to create merch that people can wear outside that would have some sort of an apologetics hint to it that could spark conversation, make people think while they're on the road. Because we see a lot of content that atheist organizations are putting out there that boldly proclaim how they are an atheist and how they challenge the theistic perspective. And we thought there is nothing of that sort that is happening in India. The cross-examined merch are way too expensive in India. Over 2 grand Indian rupees is one of their cheapest t-shirts that's available because of import costs and all of that. So we thought it's a good niche for us to contribute to and provide high quality merch that can at the end spark conversations and play their role in paving the way for an evangelistic conversation. So these are all very exciting things that we are working on in this next year as well. We are expanding on what we have worked so far, branching into new areas, expanding our video content, and making ourselves available in whatever forms possible to explore new waters, new territories, and see where the Lord is leading us. So it has been a really eventful year, and we are grateful to God for having called us into this field and into His ministry that He is overseeing.
Wow. Well, that's a ton of stuff, Jacob. Now, how many are in your team?
Yeah, so we have a core team that is involved with all the key decision making. We have a technical team that handles all the tech output and all the tech stuff. And then we have the backbone of the team, the prayer team. So all in all, we are around 15 to 16 people, with the majority being in the prayer team. And we constantly keep each other in prayers as we continue to keep the ministry also in prayers. And they continue to support and encourage us with their prayers. And so, yes, our team size would be 15 to 16 individuals from India.
And so is that on a volunteer basis?
Yeah, that is on a volunteer basis. And we look to ways where we can help them. We know that some of our team members have their own challenges to figure their way around life with their financial settings. So we see what we can do as individuals as we come together. But yes, everyone is there on a volunteer basis. We are not a registered entity. That's another thing. We are basically a web-based initiative. As we present ourselves, we are a web-based initiative. We are not a registered entity yet because of the fact that I'm a student. My core team member Piyush, who is our executive director, Ankit, he's also a student. So there's a lot of gray areas for us to figure out on how to register and stabilize us in that regard. It's a legal entity so that SAFT can operate as an entity. Right now, it's just a couple of friends coming together, doing things what we want to do, what we're called to do, and just progressing in that sense.
Well, I want to commend your team and yourself, your core group there, because I've known you guys from when you were starting out some time ago. And from day one, I've noticed that everything you do is with the goal of excellence and accountability and good structures being in place with prayer support, supporting through having directors and advisors and things like that. And so it's not just like a hobby for a couple of people. It is really an organized work that you guys are doing. And again, on a volunteer basis. And so part of the reason I wanted to have you come on here today is actually to encourage my listeners to consider supporting SAFT Apologetics. Now, SAFT Apologetics stands for Seeking Answers, Finding Truth, based in India and reaching out across the world online through various conferences that are available wherever you're at on the globe. You guys are you have a target for fundraising, but I think listeners, if you think this is worth investing into, I would encourage you to invest into it as well and help support them. We'll supply a link for you in the show notes, but Jacob, can you talk just a bit about what your goals are and what plans are on the horizon that we can help support you in?
So we're trying to raise around $500, and that would be a big chunk of our current and then the next years of expense that is coming up. Presently, the expense has to do with the speaking team that would have to travel across India to cater to speaking audience, and also the expense that is going behind with running the technical side of the ministry, the servers, all of that as well. And so maintaining all the resources that we have. So that is where the bulk of the expense is going to go to. And also recently, our team has been nominated to attend certain conferences, missional evangelistic conferences that is happening at a global level. And so to be dispatched from the team or to dispatch our team members to attend the conference is also an expense that the ministry has to look into. So we're being very careful and thinking twice before spending any penny that comes in. But we realize that as the ministry grows, expenses are bound to grow. And it's a learning curve for us to be specific, sincere, and extremely accountable with any money that comes in that we handle as individuals. So those are the immediate expenses that are coming up. As we continue to grow, one thing that any listeners to the podcast can help us with is one key area that we want to grow is to minister to the church. And if you know of an opportunity, a setting where we can come in and minister to your organization, your church, your youth group, do reach out, and we are coming and doing it absolutely for free. Our team is taking their time and energy out of our schedule, and we're doing it absolutely for free because that is what drives us. Specifically, most recently, one of our chapter directors at Reasonable Faith, Chris Gonzalez, he reached out to me and said he wants to partner with us and to create content for kids that are for non-English speaking audience. And so that means even if we don't have the team on hand to do that, we are going to network with our friends and ministry partners in India to make that happen. So networking and ministering in whatever capacity is something that drives us to do. So if you're unable to invest into us in any way possible, praying for us and networking with us is one great investment that you can do. It helps us to grow and minister and fulfill the mission that God has called us to do. And if you want to support us financially, you can check out us on Patreon to see what you can do to support us, what the Lord moves in your heart as you prayerfully consider what He would want you to do. And if you have some doubts and if you want to know more about us, you can drop us an email at info@saftapologetics.com or jacob@saftapologetics.com, and we would be most glad to reach out to you and clarify any queries that you have, any concerns that you have, or if you would want to know more about how we operate as a team. So I hope you would prayerfully consider what the Lord would want you to do to help us continue to do what we are called to do.
Well, thanks so much for coming and sharing what God has been doing through the ministry at SAFT Apologetics, Jacob. Appreciate you and your friendship, and it's great to see things happening and developing, and I'm encouraged for what's in the future. So, dear listeners, please do support. You'll find links to Patreon and the different resources at SAFT in the show notes. Thanks for listening to the podcast. If you have a question you'd like us to address or just a message for us, feedback, good or bad, you can either email us at podcast@apologetics315.com or leave a voice message for us using SpeakPipe. Just go to speakpipe.com/apologetics315 to leave us a message. And remember, if you include a Ghostbusters quote in your question, we guarantee that we'll read it on the podcast. We also ensure up to 50% better quality answers. Also, if you've enjoyed today's podcast, please leave a review in iTunes or the podcast platform of your choice, and please share this episode with a friend if you found it useful. Remember, you can find lots of apologetics resources at apologetics315.com, along with show notes for today's episode. Find Chad's apologetic stuff over at Truthbomb Apologetics. That's truthbomb.blogspot.com. This has been Brian Auten and Chad Gross for the Apologetics 315 podcast, and thanks for listening.